But now I'm happy to welcome Anu for her presentation about the automated assessment of the fairness of research data. So a topic which is very important also for the creation of the research data infrastructures, which is going more and more, getting more and more activity at the moment. And so I would like Anu to start with your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Hi, everyone. My name is Ansuriya. You can call me Anu. I'm a data scientist at University of Bremen. Today, I'm going to talk about two components developed by FAIRsFAIR, which are metrics and tool to support programmatic assessment of fairness of research data. All right, so this is my presentation outline. I will give a short introduction to the FAIR principles, and then I will briefly introduce the FAIRsFAIR Horizon 2020 project, and then I'll spend more time on the describing the components developed, which are the metrics and the assessment tool. Finally, I will summarize the current status of the work and plan work. All right, so I think there's a lot of, this is a quite hot topic about FAIR. So the FAIR principle consists of 15 principles. These are high-level guidelines to maximize the use and reuse digital resources. Example of digital resources are research data sets. For example, example of principles are to make data findable, then you should assign a globally persistent identifier to the data set. And you need to provide a rich metadata of the data set. Another example of the principle is that to make data interoperable, then you need to enrich the data with vocabularies like ontologies. Another example on enabling reusable is to attach license that clearly specify the usage restriction of the data. So these are examples of 15 principles. These principles are aspirational, so they are not strictly defined. As a result is that there's a various work that try to clarify this principle in terms of metrics. Some call it as a criteria, the other call it as a indicators. But the biggest question is that how we can measure the fair aspect, also known as fairness of research data, systematically in practice. So for FAIRsFAIR, we emphasize that we need two components to achieve this. First is the systematic representation of the metrics corresponding to the FAIR principles. And the second one is the assessment tool that support assessment based on the metric. In fact, these two components have been recognized as important by the European Commission Expert Group on Fair Data in their Turning Fair into Reality report. So now I will talk about FAIRsFAIR. FAIRsFAIR is a Horizon 2020 project started last year, March. The goal of the project is to develop solutions, both technical and non-technical solutions, for the application of FAIR principle in research data life cycles. So for example of solutions are like a data practices, recommendation, policy, expertise, training, also practical tool and services. So the work I'm going to present today is carried out under work package 4 in specific task 4.5, which focuses on the FAIR assessment pilots. All right, so let's dive into the FAIR assessment of research data. First, I will introduce the task and the scope of the task. The goal of the task I'm leading in the context of the FAIRsFAIR project is that to pilot the FAIR assessment of data sets that are already published by 5 trustworthy data repository. What is trustworthy data repository? Trustworthy data repository is a certified repository, for example, by CoTrustSeal, whose goal is to provide reliable and long-term access and preservation of data to its designated community. So as you know, the FAIR principle in theory can be applied to any digital resources, but our task really focusing on the research data. For example, observation and measurement that are collected, observed, or created or model output for the purpose of scientific analysis. And as I say before, for this task, we are aiming at two main components. One is the assessment metric and the other is assessment tool. And we are really following it for both metrics and the tool, they are developed in an iterative manner. What I mean by iterative manner is that first, we look at existing FAIR data assessment framework. From there, we come up with a set of metric, and then we implement this metric, and then we perform system testing as well as the users testing. The users testing is about using the tool developed to evaluate actual data set in collaboration with the repository. And then we use the feedback from the repository to refine or expand the metrics. And this is done in several cycles. So this is our approach. And as you can see here in the table, currently we already have 4 repositories that are collaborating with the project, and all of them are certified repository, and they belong to different domains. For example, PANGAEA mostly on the earth and environmental science, whereas we have another repository, FAIRsFAIR Italy, they are dealing with more cultural heritage collection. And we also have one institutional repository, which is CSIRO data portal, and we have a DKRZ, which archive climate model data. And we still have one slot. So if you are interested to become a tester of this tool, please keep in touch. I'll also share my email in the chat box later. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the 2 important components. So I will start with the assessment metrics. So we have developed 15 metrics. As you can see here, I also included the link. These metrics are now available on the FAIRsFAIR website for public feedback. So please feel free to visit and provide your feedback. For each of these metrics, we actually develop specification, and these metrics are developed. Also, we are not reinventing the wheel. We reuse existing work. For example, the work by the RDA FAIR data maturity model, also previous work done by the project partners, for example, FAIRDAT and the WDS assessment of data fitness, to develop these 15 core metrics. For each of these metrics, we have their specification. As you can see on the right side, the specification covers information about the metric. For example, identifier, the name of the metric, the description of the metric, and the FAIR principle. So if you can see the red box, the FAIR principle F2 is about data are described with rich metadata. But what is rich metadata? That's why we develop a metric that explicitly state what are the minimum descriptive viable metadata element required to support data findability. In addition to describing the metric, we also provide information on how this metric can be assessed and implemented in practice. As you can see, the assessment row, and we also include, for example, the assessment details such as input required to assess this metric and how this method to assess the metric. In addition to this, we also documented the related resources, constraint and limitation related to the assessment. As you can see this next slide, so these are the related resources that are important to implement the metric, and we also clearly communicate what is the limitation of our assessment methods. I think this is important because this allows us to further think about how we can better improve the assessment method in future. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the tool. So there are 15 metrics. Out of 15 metrics, we have implemented 14 of them. So the tool is called F-UJI. So F-UJI is an automated fair data assessment tool. And before I present the tool, I just want to give some concept on the assessment. So as you know, we have 15 principles. Each of these principles may have one or more metric. And for each of these metric, you may have one or more practical tests. So the tool is actually focuses on the metric and the practical tests. For example, here, as you can see, the FAIR principle F1 say that metadata are assigned with globally unique and persistent identifier. So for this metric, we have one of the metric corresponding this principle is that data is assigned with persistent identifier. But how we can test in practice, then comes the practical test. For example, in order to test this metric, we can check if the identifier is based on the persistent identification scheme like a Perl or Handle or DOI. The second test we can perform is that if the identifier resolved to a landing page through, for example, HTTP status codes. So these are the relation from the principle, how you go to the metric definition, and then how you implement the practical tests. We use a lot of different resources to support the automated assessment. As you can see, first is the metadata of the data set. This metadata comes in two ways. The first is through the data landing page. As you can see the diagram on the right. Behind your HTML code, there is a lot of information embedded. This structured information is used as part of the automated assessment. In addition to that, we also perform content negotiation to actually use the metadata from the provider API. Other than the metadata, we use also data files because we have some metric also need to check the data file. And we also use some external registry, for example, DataSite. DataSite is a PIT provider for research data. We also use their service to get additional information. We use also retrievdata.org. This is a registry of repository that provide information about API and metadata standard used by a repository. The other example is SPDX, is a registry of licenses, and then RDA metadata standard catalog, which provide metadata standard by domain or subject areas, link open vocabularies, and so on. So we use to conclude, we use the metadata and the data as well as external resources to perform the test. This is just a most simplified flow on the initial stage of the assessment. As you can see here, in order to start the assessment, you need to provide identifier. This identifier can be URL, it can be DOI or any PIT. And then based on this identifier, we will extract the metadata. I'm now talking about the blue arrows. So from this identifier, we will resolve and we will extract metadata from the data landing page, and then we will perform content negotiation. If it is a persistent identifier, we will also retrieve additional metadata from the PIT provider. All these different metadata are then merged and then used as a basis for the assessment. In addition to that, if you look at the black color arrows, we also get other information. For example, if the repository provide OAI and PMH endpoint, We also use this to extract metadata standard from the repository. But in addition to that, if the identifier is a PID, we also retrieve the information from retrieve data, because retrieve data provide information about the metadata standards and API used by the repository. So this is just about the data gathering. Now, this is a user interface. It's actually a Swagger GUI. It's so our API support two operations. The first operation is to evaluate. The second operation, metric, which provide the definition of all metric implemented. So let's look in detail about evaluate. As you can see here on the left top is the example of request, and where you provide the URL or identifier of your data set, and there are two optional parameters. Test debug, if you want to know the trail of your assessment, you can set true or false if you don't want. And the endpoint of metadata access endpoint. These are optional parameters. Based on this, we will run the assessment, and the assessment tool will return the result in the JSON format. As you can see on the right, this is an example of one metric evaluated, which is about descriptive metadata to support data findability. So each of these have a metric identifier, metric name, also output and score. We also provide the score, what is the total score, what is earned by this data set, and also test debug. This is what I meant by the trail of the assessment. It gives you a detailed information of how the assessment of all the assessment steps. So this is an example of results of 500 randomly selected data set from PANGAEA evaluated. So the upper part show a chart of before improvement, and the lower part is after improvement. So each of the four boxes represent the FAIR principle: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. The x-axis represent the FAIR score, which range from 0 to 1. 1 is the maximum, and the y-axis represent the number of data set. So the more right your bar are, the better. So what we did is, in the first run, as you can see on the top diagram, the accessibility and reusability of PANGAEA data set was not good, because most of the information exists in the database, but they were not exposed in a standardized manner. So based on this first assessment, we provided recommendation of improvement. So based on this recommendation, the data repository improved. And then if you can, then we run the second test. So the second test is the lower chart. As you can see that based on the recommendation, the score of accessibility and reusability increase. So this is what we've tried to do with the rest repositories. And I want to summarize here the status. So currently we have provided, we have done the first run with two repositories, CSIRO and DKRZ, and they are currently improving their metadata and services based on our recommendation. There's another one which currently we are working on, is the FAIRsFAIR Italy. This morning, I also have one confirmation from another repository, Dataverse.no. So hopefully they will also will come on board and become one of our repository that will collaborate with the project to test the tool developed. All right, conclusions. Let me check the time. I think I still have a couple of minutes. All right. Okay. So our approach is use case driven. What I mean by use case driven is that the goal of the task is quite specific, to evaluate data set that already published by trustworthy data repository. And we develop the metrics and the tool in an iterative manner through collaboration with existing repository. And as you can see that the metrics are developed based on existing work. So we are not reinventing any wheel. We are just adapting whatever out there to support our use case. And of course, this is done through a collaboration between FAIRsFAIR and the data pilot repository. So we perform the test and then we come up with the recommendation of improvement. We provide this recommendation to the pilot repository. They improve their services and metadata. And at the same time, they also provide feedback on the tool developed, also share the context information, which is important. And FAIRsFAIR team use this as a basis to improve the metrics and the tool developed. Something to remember about measuring FAIR data, especially in the context of this work. So our metrics are core metrics. What I mean by core metric is we focuses on the generally applicable data and metadata characteristics. But in future, this should be further expanded to take into account domain-specific metric as well. And FAIR are not new to data repository. As I said before, some of the principles already been in practice, already being implemented by the data repository, which means that if you want to translate this work into practice, we must take into account the context. Context here means, for example, disciplinary practices and the data type, which differ from one another. For example, the way metadata of social science totally different from geospatial science. And automated assessment is practically feasible in comparison to the manual assessment. However, in order to fully perform assessment in a programmatic manner, and the research data ecosystem component should be machine friendly, which means that we need a registries, we need to have metadata and data that are readable. We need to have a policy or preservation plans that are machine readable. But the reality is we know not all of them are not machine readable yet. So this is something we need to keep in mind when we perform the automated assessment. And also, of course, the work I presented today focuses on the fair assessment of data. But what equally important is that the services and the repository, they also should be FAIR enabled to actually transform the FAIR implementation into practice. These are some of the related links. As you can see, the first link is the metric specification, and the second is the FUJI. The tool is available on the GitHub, so feel free to install and test it. And also, in addition to the FUJI, we also developed another tool called FAIRsFAIR, as you can see on the right. This is a manual tool to raise awareness of researchers in making their data fair. So it's more like a checklist, also about educating the researcher about the FAIR principles. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anu, for your very impressive presentation.